Imagine a civilization, right, that builds these towering, almost like cathedral-like communal halls entirely out of woven grass.
Right, without using a single
Yeah,
nail.
exactly. Not a single nail. And they navigate through this vast wetland in these sleek handmade canoes. Their entire economy, their diet, their social structure, it's all intricately tied to, of all things, the water buffalo.
Yeah, it's incredible.
But then imagine waking up one day to find that the water sustaining this ancient way of life has been, well, intentionally turned to dust. The wetlands are just gone.
I mean, it sounds like the premise of a dystopian novel, doesn't it?
It really does.
But it is a very real, very modern piece of history.
Mm.
And it's really just one chapter in this profound story of a region where human identity has been tested by almost every conceivable force: empires, environmental engineering, modern conflict.
Right.
And yet somehow that identity just refuses to be erased.
Which is exactly what we are exploring today. So I'm looking at the stack of research notes you brought in for this deep dive, and it's unlike anything we usually review here.
It really is unique.
Yeah, because instead of sterile policy briefings or, dense academic journals, we have this thick binder filled with sketches of the Tigris River, marginalia about ancient poetry, and facts that are actually framed as inspiration for songwriting.
Yeah, songwriting and poetry.
Right. The original authors mapped out the cultural, historical, and geographical DNA of 5 distinct regions in Iraq, specifically to write lyrics about them.
Which is honestly a brilliant methodology. I mean, when you are forced to process geopolitical history through the lens of poetry and music, you kind of have to stop looking at mere dates on a calendar.
You're looking for the soul of it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have to locate the emotional mechanics behind those dates. You really have to ask how a culture actually functions under intense pressure.
And that is our mission for you, the listener, today. We are looking past the standard news headlines to explore the resilient, deeply poetic soul of Iraq. We're going to decode how identity survives through land, food, music, and the people themselves. So, okay, let's unpack this by starting at the literal cradle of civilization, the place where that water was turned to dust.
Right, so we are starting in southern Iraq, specifically the Mesopotamian marshes, which are also known locally as the Awar.
The Awar, okay.
Yeah, and this is a massive, lush, watery expanse situated right between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Historically, it's often referred to as the Garden of Eden.
Wow. And the notes mention that the people living here, the Marsh Arabs or the Ma'dan, have a culture so fundamentally tied to the wetlands that water is basically the absolute center of their universe.
It dictates everything they do.
Right. But let's look at the mechanics of this, because the notes keep highlighting these massive reed houses called mutif. So my question is, how does a culture build a permanent functional society out of something as fragile as reeds?
Well, it requires this incredible feat of generational engineering. I mean, a mutif isn't just a simple little hut.
Right.
It's constructed from these giant reeds that are harvested, bundled into really thick columns, and then bent into these massive soaring arches.
Bending giant bundles of reeds, that's wild.
It is. And they are woven together with such precision that they create highly durable, fully insulated communal spaces. The entire ecosystem revolves around this localized knowledge.
And then they have those canoes, right?
Yeah, the mashuf. They travel between these island structures in these slim, elegant canoes.
Yeah.
But really, the absolute anchor of this society is the water buffalo.
The ultimate engine of life out there.
Exactly. In the marshes, it provides the milk that becomes their daily yogurt and cheese.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, the rivers provide the fish that becomes masgoof.
Oh, masgoof. The notes talk about this. It's a staple Iraqi dish where the fresh fish is butterflied and slow grilled on steaks by an open, smoky wood fire right by the water.
It's a very iconic culinary tradition.
I can almost hear the traditional music playing in the background just thinking about it. The notes mention this traditional Iraqi folk and maqam music, driven by the strings of the oud and the breathy, haunting sound of the knee flute.
Yeah, singing about love and the land.
Exactly. And you have the men in their long dishdasha robes and the keffiyeh headscarves. It paints this incredibly idyllic picture.
It does.
But of course, the historical record in these notes pivots to a massive, deliberate devastation.
Right.
The sources outline that in the 1990s, under Saddam Hussein, these ancient marshes were drained. And to be clear, we are just relaying the historical facts as presented in these source materials, but it was a deliberate act.
Yeah, according to the documents, it was an immense, highly engineered environmental destruction. The goal, as the notes state, was to rout out political opposition that was hiding out in the dense reed beds.
Wow.
So by building a huge network of dams and canals, an ecosystem that had survived continuously since the era of the ancient Sumerians was just starved of its water source.
That's
It
heartbreaking.
was reduced to a cracked, dry desert in just a few years.
I was reading this and it struck me, it's like the marshes are a giant living set of lungs for that entire region.
That's a good way to put it.
And those lungs were deliberately collapsed. But realistically, I mean, if your entire socioeconomic system is built on water, buffalo, fishing, and reed weaving, and the water's completely gone for over a decade.
Everything changes.
Right. Doesn't the culture inevitably fracture? I mean, people are forced to flee to cities just to survive. They basically become refugees in their own country. How did that specific identity not completely dilute?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the survival of the marsh Arabs really demonstrates how cultural memory functions as a survival mechanism. Identity isn't just bound to the physical geography, right?
Right.
It acts like a highly compressed data file that's carried within the population. So even when the water was gone, the oral storytelling, the poetry, the very specific engineering knowledge of how to properly tension a reed arch for a mutif,
All of that was still there.
completely intact within the minds of the displaced people.
So it's like the blueprint survived the destruction of the building.
Precisely. And we see the proof of this after 2003. When the political landscape shifted, the local people returned to the desertified marshes.
They went back.
They went back. And they didn't wait for massive government interventions. They physically went out and started breaking down the earthen dams themselves with their bare hands.
Wow.
They let the water back in. And because that compressed file of cultural knowledge was never lost, they didn't have to relearn who they were. They just unpacked the file. The rapid restoration of those marshes proves that memory and oral tradition can actually outlast deliberate environmental erasure.
That is just phenomenal. Okay, so we just looked at how culture survives by intrinsically linking its identity to nature and water.
Right.
But what happens when identity is not rooted in an isolated wetland, but in a bustling, highly contested urban center? Because we are moving north now, from the survival of nature to the survival of ancient urban civilization, we're heading to Mosul.
Mosul. So Mosul is really defined by its extreme connectivity. It's a profound historical crossroads where Arab, Kurdish, Turkmen, and Assyrian identities have layered over each other for centuries.
And it sits right across the Tigris River from the ruins of ancient Nineveh, right?
Yes, exactly. Nineveh was the towering capital of the ancient Assyrian Empire until it famously fell in 612 BCE.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Because the modern timeline of Mosul is relentlessly dramatic. As the notes recount, the city was captured by ISIS in 2014 and endured immense trauma before being liberated in 2017.
A very dark period.
And again, remaining entirely neutral and just looking at the documented events, the world watched the literal physical destruction of incredibly significant landmarks during that occupation.
Yeah, irreplaceable history.
The Al-Nuri Mosque, with its famous leaning minaret, was blown up. Ancient Assyrian statues, the winged bulls known as lamassu, were destroyed with sledgehammers.
The physical devastation was just catastrophic.
Which makes me wonder, with so much literal destruction of its historic anchors, how does Mosul maintain its actual soul? I used to think of Mosul like a beautiful ancient painting that has been violently painted over by different empires, right?
Right.
With the original colors just fighting to show through.
I could see that.
But looking at these notes, that metaphor feels a little too passive. Mosul seems more like a piece of linguistic and cultural rebar.
Rebar. Okay, if you connect this to the bigger picture, that structural metaphor is actually highly accurate.
Right.
You can pour different concrete empires over Mosul, whether it's ancient conquerors or modern extremist groups, and that concrete might eventually crack and fall away. But the rebar underneath is what actually holds the city structure together.
And what is that rebar in this case?
In Mosul, that rebar is the social infrastructure of the people.
Okay, explain how that social infrastructure actually works. Because the notes emphasize things like an obsession-level daily tea culture and intricate local foods like kuba Mosul.
Oh, Kuba Mosul's fantastic.
Yeah, the notes describe it as this flattened, circular dish of stuffed meat and bulgur. But how do tea and food function as structural rebar?
Well, the function as mechanisms of community resilience. Mosul has a legendary, almost fierce culture of hospitality. A guest in a Moslawi home is treated like absolute royalty.
Really?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that isn't just politeness, right? It's a vital social contract. When a city undergoes constant siege or regime change, The formal institutions of trust banks, governments, police, they often collapse.
That makes sense.
So what replaces them is the interpersonal trust built over endless cups of tea and shared meals of kubo mosul. Hospitality becomes the actual glue of society. Bombs can destroy a 12th century minaret, but they cannot destroy the social reflex to invite your neighbor in for tea.
Wow, that makes total sense. The culture is an active practice. It's not just a static monument. And you see this in their weddings, too. The notes detail these massive, multi-day, extravagant weddings filled with dabge.
Yes, the depth.
And dabke isn't just dancing, right? It's this highly rhythmic group line dancing where everyone locks arms, stomping the ground in unison.
Exactly. That physical locking of arms is a very literal manifestation of communal solidarity. When the people of Mos throw a massive wedding or recite poetry in the aftermath of a war, they are actively refusing to let their city be defined solely by its trauma.
That's powerful.
And even their specific dialect, Maslawi Arabic, acts as a connective tissue.
Right. The notes point out phrases like Ahlan wa salan for welcome and Yalla for let's go. And
Yeah.
they note that these phrases are delivered with this inherent rhythmic expressiveness.
Yeah.
It's like a linguistic insistence on continuing to live vibrantly. They are absolutely refusing to be just a museum of tragedy.
It is the insistence of life in a place that has seen an immense amount of death.
Okay, so we've explored the environmental resilience in the marshes and the cosmopolitan urban resilience of Mosul. Now we're going to travel back south towards the edge of the desert to the holy cities of Najaf and Karbala.
A very different landscape.
Entirely different. And the mechanics of survival shift entirely here, too. It's no longer about water or urban hospitality. It's forged through profound spiritual devotion, shared grief, and moral resistance.
Right, so Najaf and Karbala are the spiritual epicenters for millions of Shia Muslims around the globe. Najaf is known as the Noble.
The noble.
Yes, it's a city built around scholarship, housing the Haza, where students spend decades studying intense Islamic theology and philosophy.
And the physical center of the city is the golden dome of the Imam Ali Shrine, right?
Correct. And stretching out right beside it is Wadi al-Salam, the Valley of Peace, which is widely recognized as one of the largest cemeteries on Earth.
Just staggering scale. And then just a short distance away is Karbala. Now, the notes make it clear that to understand Karbala, you have to understand a very specific historical event that occurred in the year 680 CE.
Right, the Battle of Karbala.
Exactly.
And the historical reality of that battle is the defining paradigm for the entire region. Basically, Imam Hussein, who was the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, made a stand with a very small, incredibly outnumbered group of family and loyal followers.
Like it's a massive army, right?
Yes, against the massive, well-equipped army of the Umayyad Caliphate. Hussein and his camp were deliberately cut off from water in the scorching desert heat, and ultimately they were massacred.
A devastating defeat.
But the nature of that defeat transformed the battle into the ultimate historical symbol of standing up to tyranny, regardless of the personal cost.
And what is staggering about this, reading through the source material, is how that history is not kept in the past. It feels like it happened yesterday.
It really does.
So what does this all mean for the present day? I want you listening right now to imagine the sheer logistical scale of the Arabian pilgrimage. Every single year, millions of people walk entirely on foot, often for days, traveling from Najaf to Karbala to commemorate Hussein.
Millions of people.
Yes, it is one of the largest peaceful gatherings on the planet.
The visual of it is just overwhelming. You have these literal rivers of people entirely dressed in black moving across the desert landscape.
And the sounds, too.
Yes, you hear these powerful rhythmic morning chants known as Latmiyat. The air is completely filled with phrases of deep devotion like Ya Ali and Labbaik Ya Hussein.
Which translates to, we answer you, Hussein, right?
Exactly.
Let's talk about the logistics of this for a second, because moving and feeding millions of people in a concentrated time frame is no small feat. The hospitality we saw in Mosul scales up to almost a miraculous level here.
Oh, the Makibs.
Right. Along the walking route, strangers set up these massive encampments called mawkibs. They distribute staggering amounts of free food. We're talking heavy, nourishing meals like kuzi.
Which is delicious. Slow-roasted lamb served over rice and nuts.
Yeah, and thousands of loaves of fresh samoon bread. And it is all entirely free. Funded and cooked by volunteers, driven purely by faith.
It's an economy of devotion.
But I have to ask you about the emotional engine behind all this. Because usually we think of grief as a paralyzing emotion.
Right, it stops you in your tracks.
It isolates you. So how does grief act as the mobilizing force to build this temporary metropolis in the desert?
Well, this raises an important question about the fundamental utility of sorrow. In a Western context, we often view sadness as passive,
Right.
something to process and just move past.
Exactly. Closure.
But the grief of Karbala is an active, ongoing mechanism. It is a continuing moral stance. When the pilgrims march, when they rhythmically beat their chests to the Latmiat, and when they woot for Hussein, they aren't just mourning a historical figure.
What are they doing then?
They are taking that grief and forging it into armor.
Grief worn as armor.
Yes, mourning Hussein is a way of actively renewing a vow. The logic is essentially, if Hussein could stand against an overwhelming army of oppressors, then I must stand against whatever modern oppression, corruption, or injustice exists in my world today. So the grief is mobilizing because it demands justice. It's an annual recalibration of their moral compass, a collective way of saying, we remember the immense cost of standing up for what is right, and we are willing to bear it.
It is a completely different architecture of strength. I love that. Okay, we have one final destination to map out today from these notes.
Let's do it.
We are leaving the solemn desert-bound devotion of the South, and we are transitioning to the vibrant, mountainous intellectual rebellion of the North. We are moving from the deep spiritual grief of Karbala to the sacred, joyful fires of Iraqi Kurdistan. Welcome to Suleymania.
Suleymania. Locally, it's affectionately known as Slimani.
Slimani.
Yeah. Founded in 1784, it's widely recognized as the cultural capital of the Kurdish region. And the geography is so crucial here. It's enveloped by the imposing Zagros Mountains, dense oak forests, and, depending on the season, these rolling fields of wildflowers.
Sounds beautiful.
It is. But that idyllic scenery has historically served as the backdrop for a fierce center of Kurdish nationalism, intellectual debate, and organized resistance.
The shift in atmosphere is palpable just reading the notes. I mean, we started with water in the Alwar marshes, moved through the historical rebar of Mosul into the desert grief of Karbala, and now we arrive at fire in the mountains.
Fire is a huge theme here.
Looking at the notes for Suleymaniya, it operates almost like a massive, rebellious university campus that completely refuses to let the central administration dictate its curriculum.
That's a great analogy.
There is a profound reverence for language and poetry here. The notes highlight that it's the hometown of highly influential Kurdish poets like Shirko Bekas.
Yeah, poetry is woven into the daily life there, and there's a very sharp, intentionally preserved juxtaposition in Suleymania that really explains its psyche.
What do you mean?
Well, right in the center of the city, you have the Amna Saraka, which is a Red Security Museum.
Oh, the notes mention this.
Yeah. This is a former intelligence headquarters utilized by Saddam Hussein's regime, and it has been preserved as a grim, sobering testament to the systemic imprisonment, torture, and oppression the Kurdish people faced. They literally left the bullet holes in the walls.
Wow.
It's a monument to an attempt to violently erase their identity.
But operating in direct defiance to that heavy history is the explosive joy of Newroz.
Exactly. Newroz is the Kurdish New Year, which is celebrated on the spring equinox, March 21st.
And fire is the center of this, right?
Yes. The core ritual involves lighting these massive bonfires and literally jumping over the flames.
Jumping over bonfires.
Yeah, it's this ancient festival of renewal. It symbolizes the survival of the bitter winter, both the literal winter of the mountains and the metaphorical winter of political oppression. Fire, in this specific context, is liberation.
And the mechanics of their culture really reflect that liberation. It's incredibly vibrant. Just take the language, for example. The dialect here is Sorani Kurdish. When you hear people saying slaw for hello or supas for thank you, it isn't just a greeting. The notes make the case that it's a daily assertion of linguistic survival in a broader region where the Kurdish language was historically suppressed and outlawed.
Yeah, speaking their language is an act of defiance. And the visual culture serves the exact same purpose. The traditional clothing is fiercely bright. Women wear these flowing, brilliantly colored dresses that are intricately stitched with gold thread.
And the men's clothing.
The men wear these distinct, structured suits called shalio shapik. They are making themselves highly visible. They refuse to blend in or hide.
And the music. We have to talk about the music because it's driven by the rapid driving rhythms of the large circular daft drum and the fast strumming of the timbre lute.
It's incredibly energetic.
And that music fuels the govan. We talked about the dabke in Mosul, but the govan is the massive, joyful Kurdish circle dance.
Yes, the govan.
And again, the notes emphasize this isn't just a party. When hundreds of people lock arms shoulder to shoulder in a giant circle, moving in perfect synchronization to the rhythm of the DAF, it's a physical manifestation of an unbreakable, unified community.
We really have to acknowledge how the physical geography facilitates all of this too.
The mountains.
Yeah, the Zagros Mountains aren't just pretty scenery. For centuries, those imposing rugged ranges have acted as a literal fortress.
A natural defense system.
Exactly. They had provided the physical isolation and the defensive high ground that was absolutely necessary for the Kurdish language, their specific poetry, and their defiant identity to survive the immense assimilation pressures of surrounding empires and hostile modern regimes.
A fortress of poetry. I think that perfectly synthesizes the incredible journey we've taken through these sources today.
It's been quite the journey.
It really has. I mean, we've mapped out the restored, memory-driven waters of the Mesopotamian marshes. We analyzed the cultural rebar and unbreakable hospitality holding Mosul together. We examined the massive logistical devotion and the mobilizing armored grief in Najaf and Karbala. And we ended with the fiery, mountainous rebellion and linguistic joy of Sulaymaniyah.
Which, brings us right back to the unique format of the notes we started with.
The songwriting inspiration.
Right. The fact that this research was compiled to inspire lyrics and songs makes perfect sense once you step back and look at the whole picture.
How so?
Think about the underlying mechanism in all 5 of these regions, whether it's the Maga music gliding over the southern waters, or the rhythmic Dabke line dancing in an urban center, the sweeping Latmiyat morning chants echoing in the desert, or the fierce strum of a Kurdish timbre high in the mountains.
Wow.
The single constant thread of survival in every single place is the oral tradition.
The music is the mortar.
It is the ultimate defense mechanism. I mean, throughout this deep dive, we've discussed catastrophic physical destruction, drained marshes, bombed historic mosques, systematic imprisonment.
All physical things.
Exactly. If a society places its entire identity in physical monuments, it can be erased. A building can be bombed. A marsh can be drained. A language can be banned from schools. But how do you destroy a song?
You can't.
Right. How do you bomb a poem that lives in the minds of a million people? How do you drain the memory of a shared meal or silence a rhythm played on a daft drum? You can't. The physical world is fragile, but the intangible survives.
The intangible survives. I want you, the listener, to hold on to that thought today. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope this exploration encourages you to always keep seeking out the stories that hide behind the borders of a map.
Look past the headlines.
Exactly, to look closer at the mechanics of the world around you. Because as we learned today, even if the lungs are entirely collapsed, well, as long as the song remains in the memory, they can always learn to breathe again. Take care of yourselves and keep listening.